What if everything archaeologists believed about early American settlements was completely wrong? When Dr. Sarah Mitchell decided to restore a crumbling 1800s barn in rural Vermont, everyone thought she'd lost her mind. A respected professor spending her life savings on a rotting structure that hadn't been used in decades? But when her sledgehammer broke through what should have been solid foundation stone, she discovered something that would rewrite history books and challenge everything we thought we knew about who really lived in America first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just a story about renovation gone wrong. It's about a discovery so profound that it sparked international controversy, government intervention, and a race against time to protect one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American history. Because what Sarah found beneath that barn floor wasn't just old, it was impossibly ancient, impossibly sophisticated, and it proved that someone had been living on that land thousands of years before anyone thought possible. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who saw potential where others saw problems. At 38, she was already a tenured professor of American colonial history at Middlebury College, respected for her meticulous research and unconventional theories about early settlement patterns in New England. But respect didn't prepare her colleagues for what they considered her most irrational decision yet: buying a derelict barn in the middle of nowhere. The Whitmore farm had been abandoned since 1987. 43 acres of overgrown fields and crumbling structures in Peacham, Vermont, about as far from civilization as you could get without actually being in the wilderness. The main farmhouse had burned down in a mysterious fire 15 years earlier, leaving only the foundation stones and a single outbuilding. A massive post and beam barn that seemed to defy gravity with how precariously it still stood. Sarah's colleagues at the university couldn't understand it. Dr. James Bradford, the department head, had actually staged what he called an intervention in the faculty lounge, complete with coffee and concerned expressions. "Sarah, you're a brilliant historian, but this barn obsession is becoming concerning. You've spent your entire sabbatical budget, your savings, even borrowed against your pension. For what? A barn that's ready to collapse?" She had tried to explain her fascination with the structure. Built in 1847, according to county records, the barn represented a perfect example of post and beam construction techniques that were rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. The massive hand-hewn timbers, the traditional joinery, the stone foundation work, it was a master class in 19th century craftsmanship that deserved preservation, not demolition. But even Sarah had to admit that wasn't the whole truth. There was something about the barn that called to her on a deeper level, something she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. When she'd first seen it during a weekend drive through Vermont's back roads, she'd felt an almost physical pull toward the structure. Standing in its shadow, running her hands along the weathered wood, she had experienced what she could only describe as recognition, as if the barn had been waiting specifically for her to find it. Her friends thought she'd suffered some kind of midlife crisis. Her ex-husband David had actually suggested therapy during one of their awkward phone calls about their daughter's college tuition. "Sarah, you left a perfectly good life in Boston to become a hermit in Vermont. Now you're throwing away your financial security for a barn that's probably going to collapse on your head. This isn't normal behavior." But she had learned long ago not to trust other people's definitions of normal. Her entire academic career had been built on questioning accepted narratives, on looking deeper into historical records that others dismissed as unimportant. She'd published papers on anomalous archaeological findings, on indigenous settlement patterns that didn't match standard timelines, on artifacts that suggested far more sophisticated pre-Columbian societies than mainstream archaeology acknowledged. Her work had earned her respect, but also skepticism. She was known as the professor who asked uncomfortable questions, who pushed back against established timelines, who suggested that American history was far more complex and mysterious than textbooks claimed. The barn project became an extension of that reputation. Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, Sarah spent every weekend and vacation day working on the restoration. She'd arrive at dawn, often before the morning mist had lifted from the surrounding fields, and work until sunset. Neighbors who bothered to drive down the isolated dirt road would see her tiny figure, dwarfed by the massive structure, usually covered in sawdust and paint, always alone. The physical work was therapeutic in ways she hadn't expected. After years of living in her head, of analyzing documents and debating theories, there was something profoundly satisfying about working with her hands. She learned to identify different types of wood rot, to understand the stress patterns in old timbers, to appreciate the incredible skill of the craftsmen who had built the structure without power tools or modern equipment. The construction was remarkably sophisticated. The main frame consisted of 8 massive bents, pre-assembled structural units that had been raised together in a single day, following New England tradition. Each joint was secured with wooden pegs rather than nails, creating a structure that could flex with temperature changes and settle without losing integrity. The foundation was built from locally quarried granite, fitted together with such precision that many joints required no mortar at all. What if everything archaeologists believed about early American settlements was completely wrong? When Dr. Sarah Mitchell decided to restore a crumbling 1800s barn in rural Vermont, everyone thought she'd lost her mind. A respected professor spending her life savings on a rotting structure that hadn't been used in decades? But when her sledgehammer broke through what should have been solid foundation stone, she discovered something that would rewrite history books and challenge everything we thought we knew about who really lived in America first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just a story about renovation gone wrong. It's about a discovery so profound that it sparked international controversy, government intervention, and a race against time to protect one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American history. Because what Sarah found beneath that barn floor wasn't just old, it was impossibly ancient, impossibly sophisticated, and it proved that someone had been living on that land thousands of years before anyone thought possible. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of person who saw potential where others saw problems. At 38, she was already a tenured professor of American colonial history at Middlebury College, respected for her meticulous research and unconventional theories about early settlement patterns in New England. But respect didn't prepare her colleagues for what they considered her most irrational decision yet, buying a derelict barn in the middle of nowhere. The Whitmore farm had been abandoned since 1987. 43 acres of overgrown fields and crumbling structures in Peacham, Vermont, about as far from civilization as you could get without actually being in the wilderness. The main farmhouse had burned down in a mysterious fire 15 years earlier, leaving only the foundation stones and a single outbuilding, a massive post and beam barn that seemed to defy gravity with how precariously it still stood. Sarah's colleagues at the university couldn't understand it. Dr. James Bradford, the department head, had actually staged what he called an intervention in the faculty lounge, complete with coffee and concerned expressions. "Sarah, you're a brilliant historian, but this barn obsession is becoming concerning. You've spent your entire sabbatical budget, your savings, even borrowed against your pension. For what? A building that's ready to collapse?" She'd tried to explain her fascination with the structure. Built in 1847, according to county records, the barn represented a perfect example of post and beam construction techniques that were rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. The massive hand-hewn timbers, the traditional joinery, the stone foundation work, it was a masterclass in 19th century craftsmanship that deserved preservation, not demolition. But even Sarah had to admit that wasn't the whole truth. There was something about the barn that called to her on a deeper level, something she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. When she'd first seen it during a weekend drive through Vermont's back roads, she'd felt an almost physical pull toward the structure. Standing in its shadow, running her hands along the weathered wood, she'd experienced what she could only describe as recognition, as if the barn had been waiting specifically for her to find it. Her friends thought she'd suffered some kind of midlife crisis.
Her ex-husband David had actually suggested therapy during one of their awkward phone calls about their daughter's college tuition. "Sarah, you left a perfectly good life in Boston to become a hermit in Vermont. Now you're throwing away your financial security for a barn that's probably going to collapse on your head. This isn't normal behavior." But Sarah had learned long ago not to trust other people's definitions of normal. Her entire academic career had been built on questioning accepted narratives, on looking deeper into historical records that others dismissed as unimportant. She'd published papers on anomalous archaeological findings, on indigenous settlement patterns that didn't match standard timelines, on artifacts that suggested far more sophisticated pre-Columbian societies than mainstream archaeology acknowledged. Her work had earned her respect, but also skepticism. She was known as the professor who asked uncomfortable questions, who pushed back against established timelines, who suggested that American history was far more complex and mysterious than textbooks claimed. Some colleagues respected her rigor, others whispered that she was too willing to embrace fringe theories. The Barn Project became an extension of that reputation. Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, Sarah spent every weekend and vacation day working on the restoration. She'd arrive at dawn, often before the morning mist had lifted from the surrounding fields, and work until sunset. Neighbors who bothered to drive down the isolated dirt road would see her tiny figure dwarfed by the massive structure, usually covered in sawdust and paint, always alone. The physical work was therapeutic in ways she hadn't expected. After years of living in her head, of analyzing documents and debating theories, there was something profoundly satisfying about working with her hands. She learned to identify different types of rot, to understand the stress patterns in old timbers, to appreciate the incredible skill of the craftsmen who had built the structure without power tools or modern equipment. The barn's construction was remarkably sophisticated. The main frame consisted of 8 massive bents, pre-assembled structural units that had been raised together in one day, following New England tradition. Each joint was secured with wooden pegs rather than nails, creating a structure that could flex with temperature changes and settle without losing integrity. The foundation was built from locally quarried granite, fitted together with such precision that many joints required no mortar at all. As she worked, Sarah began to notice details that seemed unusual for mid-19th century construction. The foundation stones, while clearly old, showed tool marks that didn't match the technology available in 1847. Some of the granite blocks were cut with a precision that suggested more advanced equipment than would have been available to rural Vermont farmers. The stones themselves seemed older than the barn's documented construction date, weathered in ways that suggested they might have been repurposed from an earlier structure. But it was the floor that truly puzzled her. Most barns of the period had simple dirt floors, occasionally covered with wooden planks for specific uses. The Whitmore barn had something different. A floor made of fitted stone slabs, each piece carefully shaped to interlock with its neighbors. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, creating a surface that was both perfectly level and remarkably durable. But stone floors were extremely unusual in American barn construction, more common in European structures or buildings intended for permanent, heavy use. By October, Sarah had stabilized the structure's frame and replaced the roof. The barn was weathertight for the first time in decades, and she'd begun the detailed work of restoring the interior. It was during this phase that she started finding the anomalies that would change everything. The first oddity was the positioning of the foundation stones. While examining the eastern wall's base, Sarah noticed that several of the granite blocks bore carved marks that weren't random scratches or weathering. They were deliberate symbols, etched deep into the stone. Geometric patterns, spiral designs, and shapes that looked almost runic. The carvings were old, far older than the barn itself, worn smooth by centuries of weather, but still clearly visible to anyone who knew where to look. Sarah photographed every symbol, comparing them to databases of known American colonial and indigenous markings. Nothing matched. The symbols weren't Native American petroglyphs, which she knew well from her academic work. They weren't colonial-era masons' marks or property indicators. They weren't anything she could identify from American historical records. Even more puzzling was their positioning. The carved stones weren't randomly distributed throughout the foundation. They formed a clear pattern, marking specific points around the barn's perimeter in what appeared to be a deliberate geometric arrangement. When Sarah mapped their locations, they created a perfect octagon inscribed within the barn's rectangular footprint. The second anomaly was the floor itself. As Sarah cleaned decades of accumulated dirt and debris from between the stone slabs, she began to notice that the flooring pattern wasn't random either. The stones had been arranged in a complex spiral design that started at the barn's center and wound outward to the walls. It was subtle. The individual stones varied in color and texture enough that the pattern wasn't immediately obvious, but once Sarah recognized it, she couldn't unsee it. The spiral design incorporated mathematical ratios that were remarkably sophisticated. Using her phone's measuring app and later more precise instruments, Sarah discovered that the spiral followed principles of sacred geometry, incorporating both the golden ratio and mathematical constants that weren't widely known in 1847 America. The precision was extraordinary, suggesting surveying and mathematical knowledge far beyond what would have been available to rural Vermont farmers. As winter approached and her work moved to the interior details, Sarah found herself spending more and more time studying the floor pattern and foundation symbols. She'd brought in portable work lights and spent hours crouched over individual stones, tracing their arrangements with growing fascination and confusion. The barn was becoming an obsession, but not in the way her colleagues had feared. Rather than a retreat from academic rigor, the restoration was turning into the most intriguing research project of her career. Every day brought new questions, new anomalies that didn't fit conventional explanations of 19th-century rural construction. Sarah began documenting everything with scientific precision. She photographed every carved symbol from multiple angles, measured the exact dimensions and positioning of each element, created detailed maps of the floor's geometric patterns. She was building a case, though she wasn't yet sure what she was trying to prove. The breakthrough came on a gray December morning when Sarah was cleaning the final section of the floor near the barn's northeastern corner. As she scrubbed accumulated grime from between two particularly large stone slabs, her brush caught on something unexpected, a gap that was deeper than it should have been. At first, she assumed it was just a settling crack, common in old stonework. But as she cleaned more carefully, she realized the gap was deliberate. Someone had created a hidden seam between the stones, disguised so perfectly that it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Sarah's heart began to race. In her academic work, she'd read about hidden chambers and concealed spaces in historical buildings, but she'd never encountered one herself. Using a thin knife blade, she carefully explored the edges of the seam. The gap extended much deeper than any normal joint should, and when she pressed against one of the stones, she felt it shift slightly, as if it might be movable. Working with the methodical care her archaeological training had ingrained, Sarah began the delicate process of investigating what she'd found. This wasn't just renovation anymore. This was potentially a significant historical discovery, and she was determined to handle it with the scientific rigor it deserved. As snow began to fall outside the barn's windows, Sarah Mitchell had no idea that she was about to uncover something that would challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew about ancient American civilizations. The crazy professor who had been mocked for wasting her money on an old barn was about to make a discovery that would rewrite history books and spark international controversy. The floor she'd been so carefully restoring wasn't just beautiful craftsmanship. It was a cover, deliberately designed to hide something far more ancient and significant than anyone had ever imagined possible.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights researching the proper protocols for potential archaeological discoveries on private property. Her academic training had covered theoretical scenarios, but she'd never faced the real-world complexity of uncovering something significant on land she owned. The legal implications alone were staggering. If this turned out to be a genuine archaeological site, it could trigger federal oversight, environmental assessments, and potentially even eminent domain proceedings. But curiosity won over caution. On Thursday morning, armed with proper archaeological tools she'd borrowed from the university's anthropology department, Sarah returned to the northeastern corner of the barn. The movable stone had haunted her dreams for 3 days, and she couldn't concentrate on anything else until she knew what lay beneath it. Working with painstaking precision, she began the process of lifting the stone slab. It was heavier than expected, probably close to 200 pounds, and had been fitted so perfectly that removing it required careful leverage with multiple pry bars. As the stone finally shifted and lifted, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Below the floor wasn't the solid earth foundation she'd expected. Instead, a carefully constructed stone staircase descended into darkness, each step carved from the same granite as the floor above. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each step was perfectly level, the angles precise, the surfaces smooth despite obvious age. This wasn't crude construction. This was the work of master stonemasons with sophisticated tools and mathematical knowledge. Sarah's hands trembled as she aimed her flashlight down the staircase. The beam revealed about 8 steps before the passage curved out of sight, descending deeper than the barn's foundation should have extended. The walls were lined with fitted stone blocks, and she could see what appeared to be carved symbols along the corridor walls, similar to those she'd found in the barn's foundation, but far more elaborate. The academic in her knew she should stop immediately and contact the proper authorities. The Vermont Division for Historic Preservation needed to be notified. The university's archaeology department should be involved. This discovery was potentially too significant for a single person to handle alone. But the explorer in her, the part that had always pushed boundaries and questioned accepted narratives, whispered that she needed to see more first. Just a preliminary investigation to determine if this was truly significant or merely an elaborate 19th-century root cellar. Once she knew what she was dealing with, she could make informed decisions about involving others. Sarah compromised with herself. She would descend only far enough to document the immediate chamber, take photographs for the record, and then retreat to make proper arrangements. No excavation, no disturbance of artifacts, just enough investigation to understand the scope of what she'd found. The descent felt like traveling backward through time. Each step took her deeper into a structure that clearly predated the barn above by centuries, possibly millennia. The stonework became more elaborate as she descended, with intricate carvings covering entire wall sections. The symbols weren't random decorations. They formed coherent patterns, narrative sequences that suggested a written language far more sophisticated than anything known to exist in pre-Columbian America. At the bottom of the staircase, Sarah found herself in a circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter. The walls rose to a domed ceiling supported by a series of stone arches that demonstrated engineering principles she wouldn't have expected from ancient American cultures. But the chamber's contents made Sarah's knees weak with excitement and disbelief. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with intricate carvings, but these weren't primitive petroglyphs. They were detailed astronomical charts, mathematical calculations, and what appeared to be architectural blueprints for complex structures. Sarah recognized constellation patterns, lunar phase calculations, and geometric formulas that wouldn't be rediscovered by European mathematics for centuries after Columbus. Along the chamber's perimeter stood 12 stone pedestals, each supporting artifacts that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about ancient American civilizations. Ceramic vessels with glazing techniques that weren't supposed to exist in the New World. Metal tools forged from alloys that required sophisticated metallurgy.
Most shocking of all, what appeared to be optical lenses, perfectly ground crystal discs that could only have been created with advanced knowledge of optics. Sarah's flashlight beam fell on a series of stone tablets arranged on a central altar-like structure. The tablets bore inscriptions in multiple languages, including scripts she recognized as variations of ancient Mediterranean writing systems. But how could Mediterranean languages appear in what was supposed to be an isolated American civilization? As she moved closer to examine the tablets, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race with implications she wasn't ready to consider. The writing wasn't just similar to Mediterranean scripts. It was clearly related to them, suggesting contact between ancient American cultures and Old World civilizations long before any accepted timeline would allow. One tablet bore inscriptions in what looked like Phoenician characters, alongside symbols that resembled ancient Celtic Ogham writing. Another displayed mathematical calculations written in a script that shared characteristics with both ancient Greek and what appeared to be Mayan numerals. The implications were staggering. Either these tablets were elaborate forgeries, or they represented evidence of transoceanic contact in ancient times. Sarah photographed everything with methodical precision, documenting each artifact's position and context. Her archaeological training had taught her that context was everything. Artifacts removed from their original positions lost much of their scientific value. Whatever she had found here needed to be preserved exactly as she'd discovered it.
The chamber's centerpiece was a large stone disc embedded in the floor, covered with intricate carvings that appeared to be some kind of map or navigational chart. Sarah knelt beside it, tracing the carved lines with her finger. The patterns showed coastlines, river systems, and what appeared to be trade routes connecting different continents. If this was accurate, it suggested ancient peoples had far more geographic knowledge than traditional archaeology acknowledged. As Sarah worked, she became aware of details that suggested this chamber had been used relatively recently. While the construction was obviously ancient, some elements showed signs of modern disturbance. Fresh tool marks on certain stones, areas where dust patterns indicated recent movement, even what appeared to be modern electrical work, crude wiring that suggested someone had brought lighting into the chamber within the past few decades. The discovery raised disturbing questions. If this chamber had been known to recent occupants of the property, why hadn't it been reported to archaeological authorities? Had the Whitmore family, the barn's previous owners, known about this discovery and chosen to keep it secret? And if so, what had motivated them to hide something so potentially significant? Sarah found partial answers in a modern metal storage box tucked behind one of the stone pedestals. Inside were photographs, documents, and correspondence dating from the 1960s through the 1980s. The papers revealed that Frank Whitmore, the previous property owner, had discovered the chamber in 1963 while attempting to install a new foundation for farm equipment storage. Whitmore's handwritten notes described his shock at finding the chamber and his growing realization that he'd stumbled upon something far beyond his understanding. But rather than contacting authorities, he'd chosen secrecy, apparently fearing that archaeological investigation would result in loss of his property and disruption of his family's farming operation. The documents reveal that Whitmore had spent decades secretly studying the chamber, teaching himself archaeology and ancient languages in an attempt to understand what he'd found. His notes showed remarkable dedication and surprising scholarly insight, but also growing paranoia about government intervention and academic exploitation. Whitmore's final entries, dated shortly before his death in 1987, expressed deep regret about his decision to keep the chamber secret. He'd realized the discovery's potential significance to human understanding of ancient history, but by then felt trapped by decades of concealment. He'd hoped his children would eventually make the discovery public,
but they had apparently chosen to seal the chamber and abandon the property entirely. Sarah emerged from the chamber as the winter sun was setting, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just an interesting historical find. It was potentially one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. The chamber contained evidence that could rewrite textbooks, challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient civilizations, and prove that human cultural exchange was far more complex and ancient than anyone had imagined. But with that realization came an overwhelming sense of responsibility and isolation. She was now the sole custodian of a secret that had been hidden for over 50 years, sitting on evidence that could revolutionize archaeological understanding but could also destroy her career if handled improperly. As Sarah carefully replaced the stone slab and secured the barn for the night, she knew there was no going back. She'd crossed a line from restoration hobbyist to archaeological discoverer, and the weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. The crazy professor who'd been mocked for buying an old barn had just uncovered proof that ancient history was far stranger and more interconnected than anyone had dared to imagine. But proving it to the academic world would require navigating a minefield of skepticism, bureaucracy, and professional rivalries that could either establish her as a groundbreaking researcher or destroy her reputation entirely. Tomorrow would bring impossible decisions, but tonight, Sarah Mitchell was the only person on Earth who knew that everything archaeology thought it understood about ancient America was wrong. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, laptop open, surrounded by printouts of the photographs she'd taken in the chamber. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the images seemed almost surreal, like elaborate movie props rather than genuine archaeological artifacts. But the weight of what she had experienced, the feel of those ancient stones beneath her fingers, the undeniable craftsmanship of the chamber's construction all testified to the reality of her discovery. By morning, she'd made her decision. This was too significant to handle alone, too important to risk losing to bureaucratic delays or academic politics. She needed an ally, someone with the credibility and resources to help her navigate the complex process of bringing this discovery to the world properly. Dr. Marcus Chen had been Sarah's graduate advisor at Harvard 15 years earlier, and now served as the director of the Institute for Advanced Archaeological Studies at Yale. More importantly, he's one of the few mainstream archaeologists who'd always taken her unconventional theories seriously. If anyone would understand the significance of what she'd found while helping her avoid the pitfalls that could destroy both the discovery and her career, it would be Marcus. The phone call at 7:30 a.m. was awkward at first. Sarah hadn't spoken to Marcus in 2 years, and she was acutely aware of how her request would sound. "Marcus, it's Sarah Mitchell. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need you to come to Vermont immediately. I've found something in my barn that's going to change everything we know about pre-Columbian America." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Sarah, I've known you for 20 years. You don't make wild claims. What exactly are you telling me you found?"
Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah described the chamber, the artifacts, and the implications as carefully and scientifically as she could. She sent photographs to Marcus's secure email as they talked, watching her phone's upload progress bar while explaining the context of each image. Marcus's responses grew increasingly intense as he examined the photos. "Sarah, if these are authentic, if this isn't some elaborate hoax, Jesus, this would be the most significant archaeological discovery in North America in the past century, maybe ever." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's why I called you. I'm in over my head here, Marcus. This needs to be handled properly, with full documentation and proper scientific protocols.
But I'm also terrified that if word gets out before we understand what we're dealing with, it'll turn into a circus." "You're right to be worried," Marcus said. "A discovery like this would trigger federal intervention immediately. The site would be seized under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. You'd lose control of your own property and probably face years of legal battles even if everything is handled perfectly." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "So what do I do?" "First, you don't tell anyone else about this until we have a plan. Second, I'm driving up there today. I need to see this with my own eyes before we take any official steps." Marcus arrived at the farm just after sunset, his Range Rover loaded with professional archaeological equipment. Sarah had known him for 2 decades, but she'd never seen him look as tense as he did climbing out of his vehicle. The drive from New Haven had given him hours to consider the implications of what she'd described, and his expression suggested those thoughts had been deeply unsettling. "Before we go down there," he said, pulling a heavy case from his trunk, "I need to tell you something. I made some calls on the drive up. Discreet inquiries, nothing that would compromise your position. But Sarah, you're not the first person to find something like this." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. "What do you mean?" Marcus set his equipment down and faced her directly. "Over the past 30 years, there have been at least 6 similar discoveries across North America. Ancient chambers, sophisticated artifacts, evidence of advanced pre-Columbian civilizations. Every single one has been suppressed." "Suppressed how?" "Different methods. Sites declared national security risks and sealed. Researchers who went public facing career destruction and legal harassment. In one case in Arizona, an entire site was buried under a new highway construction project just weeks after discovery." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, though she was standing perfectly still. "Why? Why would anyone want to suppress archaeological discoveries?" Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. "Because they don't fit the accepted narrative. The mainstream archaeological establishment has invested decades building theories about how and when the Americas were populated. Evidence of advanced ancient civilizations, especially ones that suggest transoceanic contact, threatens billions of dollars in research funding and thousands of academic careers built on current models." "But that's not how science is supposed to work," Sarah protested. "Evidence should change theories, not the other way around." "Should, yes, but we're not just dealing with science here, Sarah. We're dealing with politics, economics, and institutional power structures that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Sarah's discovery taking on new and disturbing dimensions. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "There's something else. The reason I was able to drive up here immediately, why I dropped everything to come see this. I've been waiting for a call like yours for 10 years. Sarah stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Marcus opened his equipment case and pulled out a thick folder. "In 2014, I was contacted by a group called the Historical Accuracy Preservation Society. Sounds innocuous, right? But they're actually a network of archaeologists, historians, and researchers who've been quietly documenting suppressed discoveries like yours." He handed Sarah the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and reports from sites across the continent, all showing evidence of advanced ancient civilizations that had been hidden from public knowledge. "They've been building a case, Sarah, waiting for the right discovery, the right circumstances, to finally break this story open." Sarah flipped through the documents, her mind reeling. Site after site showed evidence similar to what she'd found. Sophisticated stonework, advanced astronomical knowledge, artifacts suggesting transoceanic contact, all of it buried, literally and figuratively, by institutional pressure. "So what are you saying? That my barn is just another site that's going to be covered up and forgotten?" "Not if we handle this correctly," Marcus replied. "The Society has been planning for exactly this scenario. a significant discovery on private property found by a credible researcher, documented before official authorities become involved. This could be the case that finally forces the truth into the open. As they prepared to descend into the chamber, Marcus explained the plan that had been years in the making. Multiple independent research teams would document the site simultaneously. Evidence would be distributed to researchers around the world before authorities could intervene. Media contacts would be alerted to prevent any attempt to suppression. "It's risky," Marcus admitted, as they stood at the entrance to the hidden chamber. "If we're wrong, if this turns out to be an elaborate hoax, or if we've misinterpreted the evidence, both our careers will be over. But if we're right, if this is genuine, then we have an obligation to humanity to make sure the truth comes out." The descent into the chamber with Marcus felt completely different from Sarah's solitary exploration. Having a colleague witness the discovery, seeing his shocked reactions to each revelation, validated what she'd been struggling to believe about the site's significance.
Marcus moved through the chamber with professional precision, documenting everything with high-resolution cameras and precise measurement tools. His running commentary revealed details Sarah had missed: construction techniques that matched Mediterranean stonework, astronomical alignments that suggested knowledge of celestial mechanics, artifact compositions that required technologies supposedly unknown in ancient America. "Sarah," Marcus said after 2 hours of intensive documentation, his voice tight with excitement and fear, "this isn't just evidence of an advanced pre-Columbian civilization. The construction techniques, the astronomical knowledge, the cultural artifacts, this suggests direct contact with Old World civilizations at least 1,000 years before Columbus." They stood in the chamber's center, surrounded by evidence that could rewrite human history, knowing that their next decisions would determine whether this knowledge would transform archaeology or disappear into bureaucratic obscurity, like so many discoveries before it. "So we do this?" Sarah asked. "We blow up everything we've been taught about ancient America?" Marcus looked around the chamber one final time, then met her eyes. "We do this. But Sarah, once we make that call, there's no going back. We're going to be challenging some of the most powerful institutions in academia and government. They're not going to just let us rewrite history without a fight." Sarah thought about all the colleagues who'd called her crazy for buying the barn, all the academic conferences where her theories had been politely dismissed, all the times she'd been told she was too willing to embrace unconventional ideas. "Good," she said. "I've been preparing for this fight my entire career. I just never knew it would be this big." As they climbed back to the surface, both researchers knew they were crossing a line that would change not just their own lives, but potentially the entire understanding of human civilization in the Americas. The crazy professor's barn restoration had become ground zero for the most controversial archaeological discovery of the modern era. The secure conference call began at 6 a.m. the next morning, connecting Sarah's farmhouse kitchen to researchers scattered across 3 continents. Marcus had spent the night making encrypted calls to members of the Historical Accuracy Preservation Society, and by dawn, a coordinated response was already in motion. Dr. Elena Vasquez, calling from the University of Barcelona, was the first to speak after Marcus finished his briefing. "The artifacts you've described match petroglyphs we've documented in northern Spain, symbols that our establishment claims are medieval, but carbon dating suggests are far older. If your chamber shows the same iconography in an American context, it proves transatlantic contact in antiquity." From Edinburgh, Dr. Ian MacLeod's Scottish accent crackled through the encrypted line. "We've been sitting on similar evidence from Orkney Island sites for 12 years. Stone circles with astronomical alignments that match your chamber's celestial calculations. Our funding was pulled the moment we suggested connections to American indigenous astronomy." Sarah listened in growing amazement as researcher after researcher described discoveries that paralleled her own. Dr. Jennifer Runningbear, calling from the Lakota Nation Cultural Center in South Dakota, revealed carbon-dated evidence of sophisticated metallurgy among Plains tribes centuries before European contact.
Dr. Ahmed Hassan in Cairo had documented Egyptian hieroglyphs that appeared to reference American geographical features. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo University had found Jomon pottery fragments containing materials that could only have originated in the Great Lakes region. "The pattern is clear," said Dr. Caldwell from Oxford, her voice tense with suppressed excitement. "We're looking at a global civilization far more interconnected and advanced than current models allow. But every time one of us has tried to publish, we faced institutional pressure, funding cuts, or outright academic blacklisting." Marcus leaned forward toward his laptop, which is why Sarah's discovery is so crucial. It's on private property, documented before official interference, and the evidence is too comprehensive to dismiss or suppress easily. This could be our opportunity to break the wall of silence. Dr. Chen Wei from Beijing University of Archaeology raised a disturbing concern. "My contacts in government archaeological oversight suggest unusual activity in your region. Satellite surveillance has increased around central Vermont in the past 48 hours. Someone may already know about your discovery." Sarah felt her blood chill. "How is that possible? We've told no one outside this group." "Electronic surveillance," Dr. Hassan replied grimly. "Cell phone tracking, email monitoring, credit card purchase analysis. If you've bought archaeological equipment, researched ancient civilizations online, or made any digital footprint related to your discovery, algorithms flag it automatically." Dr. McLeod's voice carried urgent warning. "Sarah, you need to understand, we're not just dealing with academic resistance here. Some of these suppression efforts have involved federal agencies, international intelligence services, and what can only be described as shadow organizations with unlimited resources." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with an incoming text. His face went pale as he read the message. "Sarah, we have a problem. That was my departmental secretary. 3 men in dark suits showed up at my Yale office an hour ago, claiming to be from the Department of Cultural Resources. They're asking questions about my recent travel to Vermont." Silence fell over the conference call. Finally, Dr. Caldwell spoke, her voice steady but grim. "It's starting. The suppression protocol is activating faster than we anticipated." Dr. Running Bear's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. "This is how it always begins. Official-sounding agencies with vague authority, asking innocent questions while building a case for site seizure. They'll claim national security concerns, historical preservation requirements, or indigenous cultural protection, whatever legal framework allows them to lock down the site." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to her kitchen window. In the distance, she could see her barn, innocent-looking in the morning light, concealing secrets that apparently had triggered responses from the highest levels of government and academia. "So we do this?" she asked. "We blow up everything we've been taught about ancient America?"
"No," Dr. Vasquez replied firmly. "We implement the rapid documentation protocol we've been developing for exactly this scenario. Sarah, how quickly can you give us unrestricted access to your site?" "You're all coming here?" Marcus answered. "Not all of us, but representatives from each major research area. Elena will document the linguistic evidence, Ian will handle the astronomical alignments, Jennifer will analyze the metallurgy, Ahmed will examine the Egyptian connections. We need comprehensive evidence from multiple specialties before anyone can shut us down." Dr. Tanaka's voice carried urgent practicality. "My flight from Tokyo lands in Boston at 2 p.m. I can be at your location by evening, but Sarah, you need to prepare for the possibility that we may have only 48 to 72 hours before federal intervention." The next several hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Sarah found herself coordinating the arrival of internationally renowned researchers while simultaneously preparing her property for what amounted to an archaeological siege. Marcus returned to Yale to collect additional equipment while maintaining the pretense of normal academic routine. By afternoon, the quiet farmhouse had been transformed into a covert research facility. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived first, driving up from Boston with specialized linguistic analysis equipment. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to fighting academic battles. "I've been waiting 20 years for evidence like this," she told Sarah as they descended into the chamber together. Elena's reaction to the multilingual inscriptions was even more dramatic than Marcus's had been. She spent 2 hours photographing and analyzing the stone tablets, occasionally gasping or muttering in rapid Spanish. When she finally emerged, her face was flushed with excitement. Sarah, these inscriptions aren't just similar to Mediterranean languages, they're clearly the same linguistic family. But the American versions show evolutionary development that would require sustained contact between Old and New World civilizations, followed by long periods of separation, then renewed contact. It completely rewrites our understanding of ancient migration and cultural exchange. Dr. Ian MacLeod arrived as the sun was setting, his rental car loaded with astronomical measurement equipment. The elderly Scotsman moved with surprising agility as he set up his instruments in the chamber, muttering appreciatively at the sophisticated celestial alignments incorporated into the stonework. "Bloody brilliant," he said, examining the chamber's dome through his specialized equipment. "The astronomical knowledge represented here surpasses anything we found in European stone circles. Whoever built this understood precession, stellar navigation, and celestial mechanics at a level that shouldn't have existed in ancient America." Dr. Running Bear's arrival added a crucial indigenous perspective to the research. As a member of the Lakota Nation with a PhD in metallurgy, she brought both cultural knowledge and technical expertise that the other researchers lacked. Her analysis of the chamber's metal artifacts revealed sophisticated alloy compositions that required technologies supposedly unknown in pre-Columbian America. "These aren't European tools brought by later contact," she explained, holding up a bronze implement that gleamed despite its obvious age. The copper content and tin ratios match sources from the Great Lakes and Appalachian regions, but the forging techniques show knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist among American peoples until after European contact. As the researchers worked through the night, documenting every aspect of the chamber with scientific precision, Sarah found herself caught between exhilaration and terror. The evidence they were gathering would indeed rewrite archaeology textbooks, but each new discovery also increased the stakes of their covert operation. Dr. Hassan arrived on the red-eye flight from Cairo, bringing expertise in Egyptian hieroglyphs and African archaeology. His analysis of certain symbols in the chamber revealed connections that defied all accepted timelines of human migration and cultural contact. These symbols, he pointed to a series of carvings near the entrance of the chamber, are clearly related to hieroglyphs found in Egyptian tombs from the Middle Kingdom period, but they show evolutionary changes that suggest adaptation to American geographical and cultural contexts. The implications are staggering. By dawn, the team had documented evidence that would normally take months of careful excavation to gather, but their race against time was about to become even more urgent. As Sarah brought coffee to the researchers working in the chamber, Marcus's phone buzzed with an emergency message. "They're moving faster than expected. My contact at the Vermont State Archaeological Office just warned me that federal agents are en route to your property with seizure orders. We have maybe 6 hours before they arrive." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her linguistic analysis. "Then we accelerate everything. Sarah, we need to make our evidence public immediately before they can confiscate it or classify it as restricted." Sarah looked around at the international team of researchers who had risked their careers to document her discovery. In less than 24 hours, her quiet barn restoration had become the center of a global effort to reveal suppressed archaeological truth. Do it. Whatever it takes, the world deserves to know what really happened in ancient America. The battle for archaeological truth was about to go public, and there would be no turning back. The media blitz began at exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, synchronized across multiple platforms to prevent any single point of suppression. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, coordinating from Oxford, had spent years building relationships with science journalists who weren't beholden to institutional funding sources. Now those relationships paid off as the story broke simultaneously on 3 continents. Sarah watched from her kitchen as her discovery exploded across the internet. The BBC led with "Revolutionary Archaeological Discovery Challenges Human Migration Timeline." CNN's headline read, "Ancient Chamber in Vermont Barn Contains Evidence of Pre-Columbian Global Civilization." The Guardian went with "Suppressed History. International researchers reveal decade-long cover-up of archaeological evidence."
But it wasn't just mainstream media. Dr. Running Bear had coordinated with indigenous news networks, ensuring the story reached communities whose oral histories had long told of ancient connections the academic world refused to acknowledge. Dr. Hassan's contacts in Cairo had alerted Al Jazeera and other Middle Eastern outlets. Dr. Tanaka had arranged coverage in Japanese scientific journals and Asian news networks. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Release the evidence simultaneously across so many platforms and jurisdictions that no single authority could suppress it all. Within 2 hours, images of the chamber and its artifacts were circulating on social media in 12 languages, backed by detailed scientific analysis from internationally respected researchers. Marcus coordinated the technical aspects from Sarah's dining room, which had been transformed into a makeshift media center. "The initial response is incredible," he reported, monitoring news feeds and social media analytics. "We're trending on every major platform. The story is going viral faster than anything can contain it." But the establishment's response was swift and predictable. Dr. Robert Henley, chairman of the American Archaeological Association, appeared on CNN within 3 hours of the story breaking. A distinguished man with silver hair and decades of institutional credibility, he dismissed the claims with practiced authority. "While these artifacts are certainly interesting," Henley said, his voice carrying the weight of academic respectability, "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What we're seeing here appears to be a collection of items from various periods, possibly assembled by previous property owners as curiosities. The notion that this represents evidence of advanced pre-Columbian civilization is frankly fantasy." Sarah felt her stomach clench as she watched the interview. Henley's dismissal was exactly what the network had predicted: reasonable-sounding skepticism designed to discredit their findings before proper scientific review could occur. Dr. Vasquez, monitoring Spanish media coverage, looked up from her laptop with grim satisfaction. "They're making a mistake. Henley just claimed the inscriptions could be modern fabrications, but I've already published linguistic analysis proving they contain grammatical structures that took centuries to develop. Any expert who examines our evidence will see he's wrong." The counterattack intensified as the day progressed. Federal agents arrived at Sarah's property at 2 p.m., exactly as predicted, but found themselves facing an unexpected situation. International media crews had arrived first, along with protesters from indigenous rights organizations and academic freedom groups that Dr. Caldwell had alerted through activist networks. Agent Patricia Wells, a stern woman in her 40s representing the Department of Cultural Resources, approached Sarah with official documents while cameras rolled. "Dr. Mitchell, we have a federal preservation order requiring immediate seizure of this site for archaeological assessment and protection." Sarah, coached by lawyers the network had arranged, responded calmly for the cameras. "Agent Wells, this site has already been assessed by internationally recognized experts whose credentials far exceed any government archaeologist's qualifications. Their findings are now part of the public record. Any attempt to suppress this evidence will only confirm what we've been saying about institutional cover-ups." The standoff was broadcast live on multiple networks. Agent Wells found herself in the impossible position of either backing down publicly or forcibly removing peaceful protesters and media crews to seize a site that was already front-page news around the world. Dr. McLeod, interviewed by BBC correspondents at the site, provided devastating testimony. "I've documented 12 similar sites across Britain and Ireland that were sealed by government order after showing evidence of ancient American connections. The pattern of suppression is clear and systematic. Today's federal response proves our point exactly." The social media response was overwhelming. #Vermont Chamber began trending globally within hours, accompanied by thousands of posts from people sharing their own experiences with suppressed archaeological evidence, denied research funding, and academic blacklisting for questioning established timelines. But the establishment's response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Whittemore, a retired geologist and granddaughter of Frank Whittemore, the barn's previous owner, arrived at the property in the late afternoon. Sarah had never met her, but the family resemblance to photos she'd found in Frank's papers was unmistakable. "My grandfather spent 30 years studying that chamber. He documented everything, corresponded with researchers around the world, tried to understand what he'd found. But he was terrified that speaking out would result in government seizure of our family farm." She produced a box of her grandfather's research materials, photographs, correspondence with archaeologists, detailed drawings of the chamber's contents. Frank Whittemore died believing he'd been a coward for not revealing the truth.
but he left detailed instructions for his descendants, hoping someone would eventually have the courage he couldn't find. The revelation that the chamber had been secretly studied for decades, with documentation predating any possibility of modern fabrication, devastated the establishment's forgery claims. Elizabeth's evidence showed continuous awareness of the site dating back to 1963, with correspondence to researchers who had tried unsuccessfully to publish similar findings. As evening approached, the federal agents found themselves outmaneuvered by a situation that had spun far beyond their control protocols. Agent Wells made a final attempt to assert authority, declaring the site a matter of national security and attempting to establish a perimeter. But Dr. Hassan, arriving with lawyers from the International Archaeological Rights Organization, presented documentation that stopped her cold. Agent Wells, this site is now under international archaeological protection. We've filed preservation requests with UNESCO, the International Court of Justice, and 12 national archaeological organizations. Any interference with this site will constitute an international incident. The legal maneuvering was complex, but the practical effect was simple. The site could not be seized without triggering diplomatic complications that the U.S. government was unprepared to handle. The evidence was already public, the researchers were internationally protected, and the media coverage had made any heavy-handed response politically impossible.
As darkness fell, Sarah found herself at the center of what had become an international archaeological and political crisis. Federal agents maintaining a perimeter around her property, media crews broadcasting live from her front yard, researchers continuing their work under floodlights while the world watched. Dr. Caldwell, coordinating media response from Oxford, delivered the day's most powerful statement during a live BBC interview. For decades, evidence of advanced ancient civilizations has been systematically suppressed by institutions more interested in protecting their theories than discovering truth. Today, that wall of silence has been broken. The evidence speaks for itself. Human civilization is far older, more sophisticated, and more interconnected than we've been told. The establishment's response grew increasingly desperate as the evening news cycles picked up the story. Dr. Henley appeared on multiple networks, but his dismissals sounded increasingly hollow against the mountain of documented evidence and expert testimony supporting the discovery's authenticity. Social media exploded with support for what was being called the Vermont Revolution in archaeology. Students organized protests at universities where professors had been denied funding for similar research. Indigenous activists shared oral histories that had always told of ancient global connections. International researchers posted evidence of their own suppressed discoveries, creating a cascading revelation of suppressed archaeological truth. By midnight, Sarah's discovery had become something far larger than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about one chamber in Vermont anymore. It had become a global movement demanding transparency in archaeological research and an end to institutional suppression of inconvenient evidence. Standing in her barn, surrounded by international researchers documenting evidence that would rewrite history textbooks, Sarah realized that her restoration project had accidentally triggered the most significant archaeological revolution in modern history. The crazy professor who'd been mocked for buying an old barn had inadvertently started a global uprising against archaeological orthodoxy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the establishment mobilized its full resources to discredit their findings. But tonight, for the first time in decades, suppressed archaeological truth was winning the battle for public attention and scientific credibility. The world was finally ready to hear what ancient history had really been hiding. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m., when Dr. Yuki Tanaka's ceramic analysis equipment finished processing samples from the chamber's pottery fragments. Sarah was dozing in her kitchen chair when Tanaka's excited voice roused the entire research team. "Everyone needs to see this immediately," Tanaka called from the makeshift laboratory they'd established in Sarah's living room. The petite Japanese archaeologist was normally reserved, but her hands were trembling with excitement as she displayed the spectrographic results on her laptop screen. The ceramic fragments contained trace minerals that created a geological fingerprint, and that fingerprint told an impossible story. The clay had originated from 3 different continents. Base materials from Vermont's Champlain Valley, temper additives from Mediterranean coastal regions, and glazing compounds that could only have come from specific volcanic formations in western Japan.
This single pottery shard proves transoceanic contact, but not just contact, sustained cultural exchange. These ceramics represent fusion technology that would require years of experimentation and cooperation between artisans from different continents. Marcus immediately understood the implications. Yuki, you're saying this pot was made by people who had regular access to materials from America, Europe, and Asia? Not just access. These aren't imported goods or isolated trade items. The fusion of techniques shows cultural integration. People from different continents were living and working together, sharing knowledge, developing hybrid technologies. This represents a level of global civilization that supposedly didn't exist until the modern era. Dr. Hassan, who had been analyzing hieroglyphic inscriptions through the night, looked up from his work with similar excitement. That corroborates what I'm finding in the linguistic evidence. These aren't just Egyptian symbols adapted to American contexts. They show grammatical evolution that could only occur through sustained bicultural communication over generations. The momentum was building. Each researcher's specialized analysis was revealing evidence that supported and amplified the other's findings. Dr. Vasquez's linguistic work proved sustained Mediterranean contact. Dr. McCallett's astronomical calculations showed knowledge transfer from European megalithic traditions. And Dr. Runningbear's metallurgical analysis revealed sophisticated alloy technologies that combined Old and New World techniques. But the establishment wasn't conceding defeat. By dawn, the counterattack had escalated beyond simple dismissal to active discrediting campaigns. Dr. Henley appeared on CNN again, this time accompanied by Dr. Margaret Stevens, director of the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology, and Dr. Carl Morrison, chairman of Harvard's archaeology department. What we're seeing here is a textbook example of how sensational claims can be manufactured from ambiguous evidence, Dr. Stevens explained to the morning show host. These researchers have taken artifacts of unknown provenance, applied speculative interpretations, and constructed an elaborate fantasy that appeals to popular imagination, but lacks scientific rigor. Dr. Morrison was even more direct in his attack. Dr. Mitchell's academic record shows a pattern of embracing fringe theories and questionable methodologies. Her colleagues at Middlebury have expressed concerns about her research standards for years. This latest claim represents the culmination of increasingly desperate attempts to gain attention through sensational archaeology. Sarah watched the interview with growing anger. The personal attacks were predictable, but the institutional weight behind them was devastating. These weren't just individual skeptics, they represented the most powerful archaeological institutions in America, and their coordinated response suggested a level of organization that went beyond spontaneous academic disagreement. Dr. Caldwell, coordinating response from Oxford, recognized the strategy immediately. They're not engaging with our evidence because they can't refute it scientifically. Instead, they're attacking our credibility and creating doubt about our methodologies. It's character assassination disguised as scholarly skepticism. But the establishment had made a critical error. In dismissing the Vermont discovery as fabricated, they had also implicitly dismissed decades of Frank Whitmore's documentation. Elizabeth Whitmore, Frank's granddaughter, was prepared to demonstrate exactly how wrong they were.
The press conference she called for that afternoon, held right outside the federal perimeter around Sarah's barn, drew international media attention. Elizabeth had brought not just her grandfather's papers, but also witnesses who could verify their authenticity. Dr. Stevens claims these artifacts are of unknown provenance, Elizabeth told the assembled reporters. But my grandfather documented this chamber's contents continuously for 30 years, starting in 1963. Here are photographs he took then, showing identical artifacts in identical positions. She displayed enlargements of Frank's black and white photographs alongside current color images taken by the international research team. The correspondence was perfect, down to the exact positioning of individual ceramic shards and the precise angles of carved stone tablets. Furthermore, Elizabeth continued, my grandfather wasn't working alone. He corresponded with researchers around the world, sharing his findings and seeking expert opinion. Dr. Stevens can claim these are modern fabrications, but she'll have to explain how my grandfather managed to coordinate an international hoax starting 60 years ago. Elizabeth then introduced Dr. William Chase, a retired geology professor who had been Frank's longtime correspondent.
The elderly academic, now in his 80s, had driven from New Hampshire specifically to testify about Frank's character and the authenticity of his research. Frank Whitmore was one of the most meticulous amateur archaeologists I ever encountered, Dr. Chase told reporters. He spent decades educating himself, learning multiple languages, studying archaeological methodology. His documentation of that chamber is better than most professional excavations I've seen. Dr. Chase produced copies of letters Frank had sent him over the years, describing discoveries and asking for expert opinion on specific artifacts. The correspondence, dating back decades, provided irrefutable proof that the chamber's contents had been known and studied long before any possibility of modern fabrication. But the most devastating blow to the establishment's credibility came from an unexpected source. Dr. Maria Santos, a respected archaeologist from the University of New Mexico, arrived at the press conference with explosive testimony about institutional suppression. In 1987, I submitted a paper to the Journal of American Archaeology describing ceramics I'd found in Colorado that showed evidence of transoceanic contact. The paper was initially accepted for publication after peer review. But 3 days before it was scheduled to appear, I received a call from the journal's editor informing me that institutional concerns had forced them to withdraw the paper. Santos explained that her career had been systematically sabotaged after refusing to abandon her research. Funding applications were denied, conference presentations were canceled, and she found herself marginalized within the archaeological community. "I've remained silent for 30 years," she said. But Dr. Mitchell's courage in revealing this discovery has inspired me to speak out about what I experienced. As Santos spoke, other researchers began coming forward with similar stories. Dr. Peter Blackwood from the University of Arizona described having his dig permits revoked after discovering artifacts that suggested pre-Columbian European presence. Dr. Rebecca Thompson from Oregon State University revealed that her research into advanced indigenous metallurgy had been defunded after she published preliminary findings. The pattern was clear and devastating. For decades, researchers who found evidence challenging accepted archaeological timelines had faced systematic suppression, career destruction, and institutional persecution. The establishment's response to Sarah's discovery wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a long-running campaign to maintain orthodox theories regardless of contradicting evidence. Social media exploded with the testimony from the suppressed researchers. #ArchaeologyGate began trending as academics around the world shared their own experiences with institutional pressure to conform to accepted narratives. The story had evolved from a single discovery to a global reckoning with scientific corruption. Dr. Henley, appearing on evening news programs, found himself increasingly on the defensive. When confronted with Frank Whitmore's decades-old documentation and testimony from suppressed researchers, his responses became evasive and unconvincing. "The archaeological community maintains high standards of evidence," he insisted during a particularly contentious CNN interview. "We cannot allow sensational claims to undermine established scientific knowledge based on isolated anomalies." But the interviewer, armed with information provided by the research network, pressed harder. "Dr. Henley, we now have testimony from 15 researchers describing systematic suppression of similar evidence. Are you claiming this is all coincidence?" Henley's composure cracked slightly. "I'm not going to dignify conspiracy theories with detailed responses. The scientific community knows how to evaluate evidence properly." By evening, public opinion had shifted decisively in favor of the Vermont discovery. The combination of solid scientific evidence, documented historical provenance, and testimony from suppressed researchers had created an overwhelming case for authenticity. The establishment's attempts to discrediting had backfired, revealing a pattern of institutional corruption that validated everything the research network had claimed. Standing in her barn that night, surrounded by international experts documenting evidence that was reshaping human history, Sarah felt the weight of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just revealed one archaeological discovery. They had exposed and broken a system of suppression that had hidden humanity's true past for generations. The crazy professor's barn restoration had become the catalyst for the most significant archaeological revolution in modern history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, truth was winning its first decisive battle against institutional deception. The evidence spoke for itself, and the world was finally listening. 6 months after the discovery that shook the archaeological world, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The UN Special Committee on Cultural Heritage had convened an unprecedented session to address what had become known as the Vermont paradigm, the revolutionary evidence that was forcing a complete reassessment of ancient human civilization.
The transformation had been swift and decisive. Within weeks of the media blitz, universities around the world had begun establishing new research programs focused on suppressed archaeological evidence. The International Archaeological Transparency Initiative, founded by Dr. Caldwell and funded by anonymous donors who turned out to be tech billionaires fascinated by ancient mysteries, had documented over 200 similar discoveries that had been hidden or dismissed over the past century. Sarah's barn had become the epicenter of a new field called suppressed archaeology, the systematic study of evidence that challenged orthodox historical narratives. Researchers from every continent had made pilgrimages to the Vermont site, now protected as a UNESCO World Heritage location and managed by an international consortium of universities. But the personal cost had been enormous. Sarah's former life as a quiet college professor was gone forever. She'd been forced to take a leave of absence from Middlebury after receiving death threats from extremist groups who viewed the discovery as an attack on Western civilization. Her ex-husband had sued for emergency custody of their daughter, claiming Sarah's dangerous obsessions made her an unfit parent. The legal battle had been brutal, though ultimately unsuccessful, when Emma herself testified that she was proud of her mother's courage in revealing the truth. Dr. Marcus Chen had paid an even higher price. Yale had terminated his tenure after he refused to distance himself from the Vermont discovery. The official reason was failure to maintain academic standards, but leaked emails revealed that major donors had threatened to withdraw funding if Chen remained on faculty. He now directed the new Institute for Archaeological Truth at the University of Vermont, funded entirely by international sources. The establishment's resistance had been fierce and sometimes violent. Dr. Henley had suffered a complete professional collapse after recorded phone calls revealed his coordination with federal agencies to suppress inconvenient discoveries. Dr. Stevens had resigned from the Smithsonian amid revelations that she had personally ordered the burial of artifacts that contradicted accepted timelines. Dr. Morrison had been arrested for embezzling research funds intended for legitimate archaeological projects. But perhaps the most shocking revelation had come from Dr. Runningbear's investigation into government archives. Using Freedom of Information Act requests and international legal pressure, she had uncovered evidence that federal agencies had been actively suppressing archaeological discoveries since the 1930s, motivated by concerns that evidence of advanced ancient civilizations might undermine American cultural narratives and destabilize social order. The documents revealed a coordinated campaign involving the FBI, CIA, and Department of Education to identify and neutralize researchers who discovered evidence challenging orthodox historical timelines. Careers had been destroyed, funding had been denied, and in some cases, researchers had simply disappeared. The scope of the suppression was so vast that it amounted to a systematic theft of human heritage. Standing at the UN podium, Sarah looked out at an audience that included archaeologists, historians, indigenous leaders, government officials, and journalists from around the world. The weight of representing not just her own discovery, but decades of suppressed truth was almost overwhelming. 6 months ago, I thought I was just restoring an old barn. I had no idea that beneath my property lay evidence that would force us to completely reconsider human history. But more importantly, I had no idea that this evidence had been deliberately hidden from humanity for generations. Sarah clicked to her first slide showing before and after images of the chamber. What we found in Vermont wasn't unique. It was simply the first suppressed site that couldn't be contained by traditional methods. Thanks to international cooperation and modern communication technology, the truth finally had a voice. She presented the evidence methodically. Ceramic analysis proving transoceanic contact thousands of years before Columbus. Astronomical alignments showing advanced mathematical knowledge. Metallurgical techniques that required international cooperation. Linguistic evolution that proved sustained cultural exchange between continents. But the physical evidence, remarkable as it is, pales in comparison to what we've learned about institutional suppression. We now know that similar discoveries have been made and hidden repeatedly throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Academic careers have been destroyed, research has been defunded, and in some cases, entire sites have been physically destroyed to prevent their study. Dr. Vasquez, representing the linguistic analysis team, presented their most startling findings. The chamber's inscriptions weren't just evidence of ancient contact. They proved the existence of what appeared to be a global lingua franca, a common language used by ancient civilizations for international communication. The implications suggested a level of global organization that predated any known historical empire. Dr. Hassan's presentation on Egyptian connections revealed even more disturbing suppression. The Smithsonian had been sitting on hieroglyphic texts that explicitly described American geographical features for over 80 years. The texts had been classified as culturally sensitive and locked away from researchers, despite their potential to revolutionize understanding of ancient Egyptian exploration and mapping capabilities. But the most emotional testimony came from indigenous leaders who had been silenced for generations. Dr. Running Bear introduced Maria Crowfeather, an elder from the Hopi Nation, whose grandmother had told stories of ancient star people who brought knowledge from across the great waters. Our oral histories have always told of the time when all peoples were connected. We knew of the great cities across the ocean, of the knowledge exchanges between the star watchers of different lands. But when we tried to share these histories with archaeologists, we were told they were just myths, stories, primitive fantasies. Maria's testimony was supported by similar accounts from dozens of indigenous leaders representing tribes across North and South America. Their collective oral histories painted a picture of ancient global civilization, far more sophisticated and interconnected than any academic model had ever acknowledged.
The establishment's final defense crumbled when Dr. Chase, Frank Whitmore's elderly correspondent, presented the most damning evidence of all. Frank hadn't just documented his own discovery. He had been part of a secret network of amateur archaeologists who had been quietly documenting suppressed sites for decades. Frank left detailed instructions in his will, Dr. Chase revealed, producing a thick folder of documents. He knew that professional archaeology was corrupted, so he created an underground network of citizen researchers. They've been documenting suppressed sites, collecting evidence, and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The network had documented over 50 major sites across North America, showing evidence of advanced pre-Columbian civilizations. All had been dismissed, buried, or actively destroyed by institutional authorities. The pattern of suppression was so systematic that it could only represent coordinated policy at the highest levels of government and academia. As the UN session concluded, Sarah found herself facing questions from reporters representing every major news organization in the world. The story had evolved far beyond archaeology into a scandal involving academic corruption, government cover-ups, and the systematic theft of human heritage. Dr. Mitchell, called a reporter from the BBC, what do you say to critics who claim your discovery threatens established historical narratives? Sarah smiled, thinking of all the colleagues who had called her crazy for buying an old barn. I say that truth doesn't threaten anything except lies. If our historical narratives can't survive contact with evidence, then they were never worth preserving.
A year later, Sarah stood in her barn, now the Mitchell Whitmore Research Center for Archaeological Truth, watching international students examine the chamber that had changed everything. The site hosted researchers from 43 countries, studying not just the ancient evidence, but also the modern techniques of institutional suppression that had hidden it. Emma, now a freshman majoring in archaeology at the University of Vermont, worked alongside the international team during her summer break. "Mom," she said, looking up from her documentation work, "do you ever regret buying this place?" Sarah looked around the barn that had been transformed from the symbol of her supposed madness into the heart of a global revolution in historical understanding. Through the windows, she could see the Frank Whitmore Memorial Library, where researchers from around the world studied previously suppressed evidence. Beyond that rose the Indigenous Knowledge Center, where tribal historians worked with archaeologists to integrate oral traditions with physical evidence. "Never," Sarah replied. "Sometimes the craziest thing you can do is tell the truth." The discoveries in Vermont had proven that human civilization was far older, more sophisticated, and more globally connected than anyone had imagined. Ancient peoples had crossed oceans, shared knowledge, and built a worldwide network of cultural exchange thousands of years before the supposed Age of Exploration. But perhaps more importantly, the Vermont discovery had proven that truth, no matter how long it's buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. All it takes is someone crazy enough to keep digging, brave enough to speak out, and stubborn enough to refuse to let lies masquerade as history. The professor they once called crazy for restoring an old barn had helped restore something far more important: humanity's faith in the power of truth to overcome institutional deception. The chamber beneath her barn hadn't just rewritten archaeology textbooks, it had reminded the world that the most important discoveries often come from the most unexpected places. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's greatest discovery wasn't ancient artifacts or suppressed civilizations, it was the courage to question everything, the wisdom to trust evidence over authority, and the determination to ensure that truth, once revealed, could never be buried again. Some people inherit land, others inherit assumptions. But the deepest inheritance is the choice between accepting what you're told and discovering what's really true. Sarah Mitchell chose discovery, and in doing so, gave that choice back to all humanity. The barn still stands, no longer hiding secrets, but revealing them to the world. And every day, researchers from around the globe continue uncovering evidence that humanity's story is far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more interconnected than we ever dared to imagine. The truth was worth the digging. It always is.